On July 20, 1973, Bruce Lee was officially measured at 172 centimeters long in the autopsy record, and his brain was recorded at 1,575 grams. A normal adult brain, the same report noted, is up to 1,400 grams. That extra weight wasn't muscle. It was swelling. Fluid. Pressure. A silent overload inside the skull. And here's the detail that should not exist in any clean legend: that day wasn't supposed to end in a hospital at all. It was supposed to end at a dinner table, with a producer and a former James Bond actor, talking money and a new film. The problem is, between those two realities, between dinner plans and brain swelling, there sits a meeting that never made it into the official story the way people wanted it to. A meeting that, depending on who you believe, either never happened, or happened in the kind of tense quiet that makes grown men edit their memories for the rest of their lives. This is that story. The myth of Bruce Lee is often told like a straight line. A boy from Hong Kong. A fighter. A teacher. An actor who moved differently than anyone alive. A man who spoke in clean, quotable sentences and hit like physics was on his payroll. But in 1973, the line wasn't straight. It kinked. It blurred. It doubled back on itself. Because in those final weeks, Bruce wasn't just a star. He was a negotiation. He was money, and reputation, and future contracts, and competing loyalties packed into one 32-year-old body that didn't seem to know how to slow down. According to later accounts, the morning of July 20th, he typed a letter about major deals on the table, multiple offers, a growing empire. Not a man expecting his day to stop early. And yet that same day, those close to him would describe heat, exhaustion, a headache, dizziness, water, and a kind of rest that didn't look like rest at all. Almost no one noticed what changed in that morning. Because Bruce Lee had always lived like a man sprinting through doors before they were fully open. He was the kind of person who could meet you in his studio office, talk a film into existence, then demonstrate it with his whole body as if the room was already a set. And on that day, there was a film in question. A film with a title that sounded like a warning: Game of Death. A project partially formed, partially filmed, and surrounded by the sort of creative arguments that only happen when a man believes the work is bigger than the business. But the business always arrives. And in Hong Kong, in 1973, the business didn't arrive alone. It arrived with men who smiled while they calculated. It arrived with people who knew where you lived. And it arrived with the quiet understanding that a star doesn't only belong to himself. He belongs to the company. He belongs to the audience. He belongs to the headlines. And sometimes, he belongs to the people trying to steer the legend before it gets away from them. What happened next didn't look dangerous from the outside. It looked like meetings. It looked like phone calls. It looked like a schedule. But the most unsettling stories are always dressed like ordinary days. That afternoon, Bruce moved in Golden Harvest's orbit, producer Raymond Chow around him, plans being discussed, and George Lazenby involved in talk about Bruce's next move. An English-speaking associate at the studio sat in on parts of that discussion as a language bridge. And if you only hear the clean version, it's simple. Bruce meets. Bruce talks. Bruce makes plans. Then he leaves. But there's a detail in the commonly repeated timeline that makes the day feel misaligned. Bruce cancels. He doesn't go to lunch. He chooses an apartment instead. Not a restaurant. Not a public place. An upstairs flat with curtains and quiet. The address, repeated for decades in retellings, was 67 Beacon Hill Road. And the name tied to it was Betty Ting Pei, an actress who would become inseparable from the last chapter whether she wanted it or not. It's easy, with hindsight, to treat that as scandal first. But scandal is just the loud surface. Underneath it is a more practical question. Why would a man on a tight schedule building deals, planning dinner with a producer and a famous actor, choose to disappear into a private apartment in the middle of the day? Later accounts suggest he wanted privacy. Something brief. Something hidden. Some hash. Some sex. Mostly talk, excitement, and the strange relief of stepping away from business eyes. But that's still the public story. The whispered story begins with something else. Because there are people who insist the meeting that matters wasn't the one at Golden Harvest. It wasn't the conversation about casting. It was the small, nearly undocumented exchange that happened after, when a different door closed, when the air got heavier, and when at least a handful of people left that day with the feeling that Bruce Lee had just been measured by someone who wasn't impressed by legends. According to those present, the mood shifted before anyone admitted it had shifted. And that's where the last meeting nobody talks about truly lives. Not in an official file. Not in a press release. In the pauses between testimonies. In the way people tell the story quickly, like hurrying past a dark room in your own house. Because once Bruce was at that apartment, time starts acting strange. The heat becomes a character. The rooms become small. The distance between decisions shortens. Raymond Chow arrives later, around early evening in the main retelling, and what he walks into is described like something almost normal. Water on the table. Conversation. Bruce animated, acting out scenes with his body, getting thirsty, getting dizzy. But the version of events that survives in print is not the only version that circulated. In private recollections, people argued over one missing piece, the moment just before Bruce says he has a headache. The moment when someone says something that doesn't belong in a friendly script discussion. The moment when a meeting stops being a meeting and becomes a line you can't uncross. There are two reasons stories like that don't make it into official retellings. The first is obvious. Nobody wants to be the person accused of pushing the first domino. The second is more subtle. When a legend dies, the people around him don't just protect themselves. They protect the shape of the legend. And that shape has rules. Bruce Lee can't look like a man who was cornered. He can't look like a man who walked into a room unprepared. He can't look like someone else controlled the day. So the story gets smoothed. The timeline gets polished. And any meeting that would make the ending feel less like fate, and more like pressure, becomes something you don't mention at all. But pressure leaves fingerprints. It shows up in behavior. And on that evening, behavior is the only evidence that matters. Bruce lies down. Not fully dressed. Not like a man waiting for dinner. Like someone whose skull feels too tight for his thoughts. A headache moves from annoyance to warning. Someone offers a pill. Equagesic. A small object. Ordinary looking. The kind of thing that should never be able to touch a man like Bruce Lee. And yet he takes it. Because sometimes the strongest people make the most normal decisions. Because that's what strength can do to you. It convinces you you'll be fine. Raymond Chow leaves to pick up Lazenby. A restaurant waits with bright lights and polite voices. But the night begins splitting into two films. In one film, the dinner happens. In the other, a bedroom door closes. A phone rings. A receiver lifts. A voice says, he's still sleeping. And something in the pause afterward feels wrong. Not dramatic. Just wrong. What happened next stunned the people closest to the apartment, because it looked like something they'd seen before. 2 months earlier, Bruce had collapsed in Hong Kong and survived. So the idea of sleep didn't sit clean in anyone's mouth anymore. Sleep was suspicious now. Sleep was a disguise. As the calls continue, the language changes. It stops being casual. It becomes careful. Then it becomes urgent. And inside that apartment, the confrontation becomes microscopic. It's not Bruce against a man. It's Bruce against his own failing rhythm. Breath by breath. A body is either responsive, or it isn't. A shoulder either rises when you shake it, or stays heavy. A face either turns toward your voice, or doesn't. The moment you realize which one it is, your own heart starts running. According to the more detailed retellings, when Betty finally tries to wake him for real, she doesn't begin with panic. She begins with softness. A whisper. A hand on the shoulder. Then a push. Then a shake. Then a voice loud enough to scrape the throat. And still nothing. If you've ever watched a person become unmovable while still warm, you know what that does to the room. The room loses oxygen. Not literally. Emotionally. Everything becomes thinner. Harder. Sharper. A call is made back to Raymond Chow, and now it's not about dinner. It's about emergency. Chow drives back across town in the old world way, when a city still had pay phones and redials and long moments where you couldn't do anything except wait for the line to stop being busy. Each stoplight is a trap. Each minute is a theft. Inside his mind, another memory is already playing: the earlier collapse, the earlier fear, the earlier reminder that a body can go sideways without warning. He arrives, and the sight in the bedroom has no glamour. No legend. Just a man on a low mattress, still, and an actress beside him trying not to fall apart. Now comes the most dangerous part of the entire night. Not death. Not yet. The consequences. Because a famous man can die. But where he dies becomes an accusation. And who he dies with becomes a target. So while the room is trying to resurrect a body, it's also trying to resurrect a story that will protect the living. A doctor is called. Not a hospital. A doctor to the apartment. That choice alone tells you the fear in the room had layers. And when the doctor arrives, he doesn't find a groggy man. He finds a deep coma. No pulse you can trust. No breath you can hear. No response. He tries anyway. 10 minutes of procedure. 10 minutes of human refusal to accept the obvious. And then reality wins, quietly, the way it always does. At this point, another confrontation begins. Not physical. Strategic. Because somebody in that apartment understands the scandal forming like thunder. The most famous man in Hong Kong is in a private bedroom that isn't his wife's. If he is declared dead there, the story becomes permanent. It doesn't matter what killed him. It will be interpreted through that location forever. So choices get made fast. Clothes appear. Shoes. A body is turned from private to presentable. And even if you don't know the exact movements, you can imagine the hands doing it. Button by button. Lace by lace. Not out of cruelty. Out of panic and instinct and the brutal knowledge that a legend must be staged, even in death, or it will be torn apart. An ambulance is called, and even if the people who arrive treat him like he might still be living, the atmosphere in that apartment has already crossed into something else. A performance of emergency. A ritual that buys time. A corridor of plausible deniability. The paramedics do what they're trained to do. CPR. Oxygen. Hands on a chest that won't answer. And through the ride, the city outside the windows keeps moving, unaware that a cultural earthquake is in the back of an ambulance. At the hospital, the final conflict becomes unbearable. Because that's where family meets rumor. That's where a wife arrives still believing in survival. That's where she sees machines and doctors and movement, and only later recognizes the most terrifying line in medicine. A flat readout. A refusal of the heart to return. The death becomes official. The time becomes a number. But the story does not settle. Because now the last meeting, the one nobody talks about, starts multiplying. It becomes 1,000 imagined meetings. In bars. In studios. In backrooms. In the minds of fans who cannot accept that a body can fail without an enemy. This is where myth begins doing what myth does. It tries to give the ending a human face. Someone to blame. Someone to punish. Someone to chase. And that is exactly what happened. In the days after, public anger didn't just simmer. It erupted. People protested. Threats appeared. Fake bombs were planted with messages meant to terrify, meant to suggest vengeance, meant to keep the story violent even after the body was gone. And the colonial government, alarmed not by grief but by instability, pushed toward an inquest because the city needed an answer it could live with. But even the experts couldn't agree in a way that satisfied the hunger of the crowd. Cerebral edema was the medical endpoint. But what caused it became a rotating door of theories. A drug reaction. Cannabis. Heat. Water. A rare combination of stressors that lined up in the wrong order. The more uncertain the cause, the more confident the rumors became. Because rumor doesn't need proof. Rumor only needs a gap. And July 20, 1973 is full of gaps. A missing stretch of hours behind curtains. A body moved from private to public. A first press story that didn't match the address where the ambulance picked him up. Statements that shifted as facts leaked out. A timeline that had to be adjusted, not for medicine, but for reputation. This is why the meeting nobody talks about matters even if you can't prove it happened exactly the way it's whispered. Because we know this much is true in the human sense. People managed the narrative immediately. And when narrative management begins that fast, it means the truth was too sharp to present raw. It needed wrapping. Padding. Softening. So the story we inherited is a story with fingerprints wiped off it. Not clean. Just handled. And the confrontation you can still feel, decades later, isn't Bruce in combat. It's the confrontation between how he actually died and how the world needed him to die. The world needed a duel. A curse. A poison. An enemy. Something that fits the way he moved on screen. But what it got was a bedroom. A headache. A pill. A closed door. Phone calls. A busy line. A rushed drive. A doctor arriving too late. And then a city trying to decide whether to mourn or investigate. So when someone mentions the last meeting that nobody talks about, maybe they're not talking about a secret villain at all. Maybe they're talking about that moment when the room realized Bruce Lee was slipping away. And everyone present understood, in the same instant, that the legend was about to become a liability. That's the meeting. Not a handshake. Not a deal. A silent agreement forming without words. Protect the image. Protect the family. Protect the company. Protect yourself. And once that agreement exists, even for a second, it becomes the most influential conversation of the entire night. Because it shapes everything after. What gets said to police? What gets said to reporters? What gets said to the public? What gets left out? And what gets swallowed? In the end, the numbers remain. 172 centimeters. 1,575 grams. A body that can be measured. A swelling that can be recorded. And beyond that, a set of human choices that can never be fully measured, because they happen in panic, in private, and under the weight of a legend too big to die cleanly. That's why the final hours still feel unfinished. Not because the medical facts are missing. Because the human truth is. Because every person who walked out of that apartment carried two versions of the night. The one they lived. And the one they told. And somewhere between those two versions, the last meeting still waits. Not as a conspiracy. As a shadow. And if you listen long enough, you can hear what shadows always contain. Not answers. Breath. Hesitation. And the quiet sound of history being edited while it's still warm.